Mary Queen of Scots and her hopeless husbands. Mary Queen of Scots started life at the top. She was queen of her own country at 1 week old and queen twice over at 15, when her first hopeless husband became King of France. A year later he died, leaving the tall, beautiful and charming Scottish queen all on her ownsome. You're about to find out how the most desirable widow in Europe ended up going from one totally hopeless husband to another, and how they helped her down the road to ruin.
Chapter 1. Infant Queen.
Mary was born on the 8th of December 1542, in the middle of a war with England. Just 6 days later, her father, King James V, died, leaving his tiny daughter, Queen of Scots. The kingdom she inherited was a mess. It was dominated by powerful nobles who were split down the middle along religious lines. Some were Protestant, some Catholic. But the biggest problem for Scotland was its powerful neighbour, England. For centuries, war between England and Scotland had been more or less an annual fixture, basically because the kings of England wanted to take over Scotland. Mary's granddad, James IV, was married to Henry VIII's sister, but that didn't stop Henry attacking Scotland. And as a result, James IV was killed at the Battle of Flodden in 1513. This meant that her dad became King of Scots when he was not yet 2 years old. When James grew up, he realised that he needed some powerful allies against his uncle Henry, so he decided to strengthen his ties with France by marrying a French princess. Scotland had a long tradition of being friends with France, because France had a long tradition of being enemies with England. James's first wife died a few weeks after she arrived in Scotland. For his second wife, James chose another French woman, Marie of Guise. Marie and James had 2 sons, but both died when they were little. While Marie was pregnant with her third child, war broke out between England and Scotland again. The Scots were defeated at the Battle of Solway Moss in 1542, and James went into a decline. The news of his daughter Mary's birth didn't cheer him up at all. James had lots of children by different women, and Mary had 6 older half-brothers. But she was James's only legitimate living child, so she inherited the throne when Daddy died a few days later. Marie of Guise wrote to her mother, Antoinette, Duchess of Guise,
"Dearest Mama, a brief note at this sad time. Do not believe the rumors you hear. Mary is a beautiful, healthy baby. I hear that King Henry of England wants her to marry his son, Edward. Let's hope it works out. We could do a lot worse, and the Scottish Protestants may even agree to it. Your affectionate daughter, Marie."
Marie of Guise was right. Henry was dead keen to marry baby Mary to Prince Edward. It would mean that when Henry was dead and gone, Edward and Mary could rule England and Scotland as joint king and queen. And more importantly, Henry could in the meantime rule both countries on behalf of them both. But within a year, the situation in Scotland had changed and the Catholics had the upper hand. They didn't want an alliance with England, so they refused to sign the treaty that Henry had drawn up. Mary's first engagement was off, and she wasn't even a year old. Henry VIII died in January 1547. The new King of England, Edward VI, was only 10, so he wasn't making too many decisions. Instead, his uncle, the Duke of Somerset, came rampaging up to Scotland for another battle with the Scots. The King of France, Henry II, wanted to keep in with the powerful Guise family. What better way than by marrying his 3-year-old son to 4-year-old Mary Stuart, granddaughter of the Duke of Guise? With the Scots beginning to realise they couldn't defeat the English on their own, a deal was made. Mary would marry Henry II's son and heir, the Dauphin, Francis. She would go to live and be brought up in France, and French troops would come to Scotland to help defend Scotland against the English.
Chapter 2. Over the Sea to France.
So little Mary said goodbye to her mamma and set off across the sea to France, accompanied by her older half-brother, James. It was a dramatic trip. At Dumbarton, the ship was held up for 10 days and everyone was seasick, except Mary. There were storms all the way down the west coast of England, which made everyone seasick, except Mary. At Lizard Point, there were even more storms, and the ship's rudder broke, leaving them in danger of running aground. Of course, everyone was seasick here too, except Mary. Mary's gran, Antoinette, Duchess of Guise, had never seen her before, but when Mary finally arrived in France, Gran fell in love with her immediately.
August 1548. My beloved daughter, your darling girl is safely arrived. What a charming child! Such beautiful skin, such hair, such a well-formed mouth, and so intelligent. I know that the King of France will adore her. However, your little darling has no language but Scots. May I take the liberty, therefore, of dismissing Lady Fleming, who seems a bit temperamental, from her post, and substituting a more elegant French governess in her place? Your loving Mama.
September 1548. Dearest Mamma, so glad to hear that Mary arrived safely and that everyone loves her as much as I do. However, I beg you, do not dismiss Lady Fleming. I am anxious that Mary keep her Scots tongue. From all accounts, the little French boy is not in good health. God forbid anything should happen to him. But if it does, then one day she may return and rule this dank and misty kingdom. Marie.
Mary was more or less adopted by the French royal family. She lived with the royal children and was thoroughly spoiled. At that time, Italian architects and painters were coming to France to build and decorate fabulous palaces and gardens. It was warm, it was sunny, their royal parents adored them.
1551. Dearest Mamma, you asked about Francis's health. Well, he's better now it is summer, but he gets many colds and he often has earache. He is a poor sickly prince, but don't worry, I love him just the same. Mary.
1558 was a big year for Mary. She was 15, which in those days was considered old enough for girls to marry. The Dauphin was only 14, and a pretty puny 14 at that. But Henry II wanted the marriage so that he could call on Scottish troops to help fight England. On the day of the wedding, Mary turned up looking radiant in a white dress embroidered with diamonds and sapphires, under a blue velvet cloak edged with ermine. Lord Brantôme, an eyewitness at the wedding, was bowled over by Mary.
She appeared 100 times more beautiful than a goddess of heaven. If the kingdom of Scotland was anything of a prize, the queen was far more precious than it. For even if she had neither sceptre nor crown, her person alone was worth a kingdom, yes.
Mary and Francis already shared one kingdom and were lined up to share another. By the end of the year, Mary was laying claim to a third crown. In November, her cousin, Mary I of England, died. Mary's heir was her half-sister, Elizabeth. But the Catholics didn't want Liz for their queen because she was Protestant. And guess who was heir to the throne of England if Liz was overthrown? None other than our heroine, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary's father-in-law, Henry II, decided to stake a claim on her behalf. He declared that she was Queen of England and Ireland, as well as Scotland. This did absolutely nothing for Mary's relationship with her cousin Liz, and the day was coming all too soon when Mary would need Elizabeth for a friend.
Chapter 3. Queen of France.
Mary was Dauphiness for just a year. In that time, France was in a terrible state because there was no money and civil war had broken out between Catholics and Protestants. Meanwhile, there were plans afoot for the Princess Elizabeth, the Dauphin's sister and by this time Mary's best friend. Henry II wanted her to marry King Philip of Spain. It was in the middle of preparations for this that tragedy struck.
King Henry II was badly injured in the jousting lists yesterday. After a successful day at the tournament, held to celebrate the forthcoming double wedding of his daughters Elizabeth and Claude, the king challenged the Count of Montgomery to one final joust. Excitement turned to horror as the Count's lance splintered and a large piece went into the king's eye. Last night, his condition was said to be serious.
Almost before they knew it, Henry had died. Pudgy Francis was King of France, and Mary was Queen. She was 16 years old, and she was a lot more clued up than her husband. She was interested in government, although Francis's mum, Catherine of Medici, ran the show, with Mary's Guise uncles to help her. In June 1560, news arrived that Mary's mother, whom she hadn't seen for 9 years, had died in Scotland. Mary was distraught. With the news of her death came other bad news. The English were attacking the port of Leith. Mary had to act for herself now. She sent messengers to conclude a treaty with the English. The Treaty of Edinburgh said, 1. All English troops would back off in return for all French troops withdrawing from Scotland. 2. The King and Queen of France and Scotland had to stop calling themselves King and Queen of England. Cousin Liz would have been really pleased about this, if only Mary had got round to signing it. However, Mary didn't sign it. Partly because husband Francis wasn't keen on giving up his title to the English throne. It didn't matter much anyway, because the sickly prince fell ill once again, and this time all the soup and sympathy Mary offered couldn't save him. Francis died in December 1560, and Mary was a widow at the age of 18. Even though her husband was nobody's idea of a cool dude, Mary was still really upset. She also realized that she had no power at all now that Francis was dead. The best solution was to find herself another important husband. Top of the list was Don Carlos, son of the King of Spain. But Catherine de Medici wasn't keen. She didn't want Mary allied with Spain because her daughter Elizabeth was married to the King of Spain, and if anything happened to Philip, Mary would become queen instead. Mary began to wonder whether the best thing would be just to hot-foot it back to the land of her birth. Unfortunately, the Scottish Parliament, the Estates, weren't that keen on their young queen coming back. In the end, they said she could come, provided she didn't make them all turn Catholic. Mary agreed. She didn't mind what religion people were, provided that she could continue to practice her Catholic religion in private. But to get back to Scotland, Mary had to get permission from her cousin Liz to travel through her territories. Liz was a bit narked that Mary hadn't signed the Treaty of Edinburgh, so she said no. Now, Mary could be a bit of a drama queen, so she sent a letter to the ambassador.
Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, if my preparations were not so advanced, peradventure your mistress the Queen's unkindness might stay my voyage. But I am prepared to adventure the matter whatever come of it. I trust the wind will be so favourable as I do not need to come to the coast of England. And if I do, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, your mistress the Queen shall have me in her hands to do her will of me. And if she be so hard-hearted as to desire my end, she may then do her pleasure and make a sacrifice of me. Peradventure, that casualty for me might be better for me than to live.
In other words, up yours, Lizzie. Mary decided that she would go back to Scotland the way she had come, by sea, without going anywhere near England. In fact, Elizabeth never got into fights if she didn't have to, and believed passionately in the right of kings and queens to rule their own countries. She just objected when they wanted to take over hers. And so it was that one foggy morning in August, Mary arrived safely in Scotland. After 13 years in France, the Queen of Scots had come home.
Chapter 4. The Wild West of Europe.
Mary was only 18 years old when she landed in Scotland. From the start, she had 3 big problems. 1, she was a woman. Women had a tough time as rulers anywhere, but Scotland was the rugged Wild West of Europe, and the men bossed the women around even more than usual. 2, she was a Catholic. Many of the Scots nobles were Protestant, and power was in the hands of a little group who called themselves Lords of the Congregation. And they weren't too thrilled to have their Catholic queen back. 3, she was an outsider. She'd been brought up in France, which meant she didn't have a hope of understanding all the family squabbles that passed for politics in 16th century Scotland. Considering she was a Catholic queen in a Protestant country, Mary got off to quite a good start. The common people took to her in a big way. She spoke to them in their own language, and they thought she was fantastic. However, the nobles were more interested in arguing with each other than they were in forming a united front behind their queen. Among the most important nobles were Mary's eldest half-brother, James Stuart, James Hamilton, Earl of Arran, Lord William Maitland, and James Douglas, Earl of Morton. They were all pretty nasty pieces of work. There was also James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a tough customer who had a string of girlfriends. Watch out for this one. He plays a big part in Mary's story later on. Apart from showing her own people who was boss, or trying to, Mary had 2 ambitions in her first year. She wanted to meet her cousin Elizabeth in person and persuade her to make her heir to the English throne. She also wanted to marry some powerful ruler. In a way, the 2 things were intertwined, because as heir to the English throne, Mary was more likely to catch a decent husband. The trouble was, if she seemed too Catholic, there was no way she would be named as Lizzie's successor. And if she seemed too Protestant, she would rule out most of the powerful European rulers for a husband. It was all a bit tricky. In actual fact, Mary didn't have a hope of turning Scotland back to Catholicism, even if she wanted to. The Protestant lords were too used to running the show. Besides, she had another very bossy man to contend with. His name was John Knox. He tried to lay down the law to Mary, and she tried to lay the law down back. Trouble blew up on her very first Sunday.
Diary, 24th August, 1561. What an awful start. When we tried to celebrate Mass this morning, a vile thug of a man called Patrick Lindsay came rushing through the streets at the head of a noisy mob, all shouting that the celebration of Mass pierced the hearts of all, and screaming that they would lynch my poor priest. Thank goodness for Brother James, who placed himself between the mob and the chapel door.
Mary made her brother James Earl of Moray, just to say thanks. The following Sunday, Mary tried to keep the peace by going to a Protestant service. But John Knox wasn't interested in peacekeeping. He announced,
"And I say to you The celebration of a single papish mass is more fearful to me than if 10,000 armed enemies were landed in any part of the realm and come to suppress the true religion.
Mary was more than a bit annoyed at Knox. After all, she wasn't interfering with his religion, so he shouldn't interfere with hers. She summoned him to the palace, where they had a right old ding-dong.
You are stirring up trouble and inciting people to rebel against their lawful sovereign.
Aye, but are you their lawful sovereign? I'm no sure a woman has any right to rule. Mind you, provided you mind your P's and Q's, I'll allow it. I'll keep my doubts to myself.
It seems that you think my subjects should obey you and not me, that they should do what they like and not what I command. So it follows that I am subject to them, not they to me.
Subjection to God's true kirk is the only thing that matters. That will take the people to everlasting glory.
Yes, but you are not the kirk that I will nourish. I will defend the Kirk of Rome, for I think that is the true Kirk of God.
Aye, well, I'll have to put up with you, I can see. But when children hae a mad father, they have to restrain him. To me, it's exactly the same thing with a Catholic monarch. It's the duty of the subjects to disobey.
Oh, go away. You are too extreme for me.
The worst thing was, it wasn't only the Protestants who were giving Mary grief. The Catholics couldn't work out why she wasn't sticking up for the old religion, and they started giving her a hard time too. Poor old Mary had hardly been back 5 minutes, and she was annoying people left, right and centre.
Chapter 5. Stalkers and Suitors.
It was inevitable that a queen as young and glamorous as Mary would attract nutcases who got fixated on her. One of these was the Earl of Arran, who became obsessed with her. He told people his secret plans of kidnapping and marrying her. Arran claimed that it wasn't his idea, but Bothwell's. He's the one I told you to remember earlier. And both of them had to appear before the Queen's Council. In the end, Bothwell skipped the country, but Arran was locked up for the rest of his life. Ever since she'd been widowed, Mary had been keeping her eye out for a suitable husband. Among the men she considered marrying were Don Carlos of Spain, Archduke Charles of Austria, King Charles IX of France, Mary's ex-brother-in-law, who was madly in love with her, and Sir Robert Dudley, a favourite of Queen Elizabeth. The trouble was, picking any one of these would upset someone. Catherine de Medici, her cousin Liz, or the Scottish nobles. It was important to keep everyone happy, especially Liz, who had said that if Mary married to her satisfaction, she would make the Scottish Queen her heir.
Diary, January 1565. The French marriages are both off, and so is the Spanish. I know who to blame. The truth is, no one wants to get on the wrong side of my cousin Liz. No matter how young and beautiful I am, they all see me as a liability. I think I should forget all about getting married and go and have a holiday.
It was while Mary was away on a hunting trip in Fife that she met her second, hopeless husband, Henry, Lord Darnley. Mary was feeling unloved and unwanted by all the eligible princes of Europe, and she liked the look of Darnley. She said,
"He is the lustiest and best proportioned lang man that I have ever seen."
What she meant was, he was tall and a bit of a hunk. This might have been true, but Darnley was a bad lad, into wine and women. He was also selfish and weak. But Mary noticed none of these things. She saw a gorgeous guy who knew how to behave in royal circles.
Diary, March 1565. He is such a gentleman. He complimented me on my dancing and my voice, and gazed into my eyes with such feeling. Is he in love with me? I think he is. And I cannot believe my luck. I have found the perfect husband. As if his looks and character were not enough, we are cousins. Together our claim to the English throne will be unbeatable. Oh, bliss! I am in love!
Darnley was all charm, until he was sure Mary was in love with him. Then his attitude changed, and he became inconsiderate and rude. But Mary was going to marry her beloved Lang man, come what may. She had to get permission from Elizabeth, so Mary sent her a letter, but she didn't bother to wait for a reply. Elizabeth was beside herself with fury when she received Mary's letter. The first thing she did was lock up Darnley's mother, the Countess of Lennox, in the Tower of London. Then Sir Nicholas Throckmorton was sent riding up to Scotland to tell Mary that if she married Darnley, she would never get the English throne. If she married Robert Dudley, though, Liz might consider changing her mind. Mary sent a message back to Liz, telling her to get lost. She'd choose her own husband. Thanks very much. The Earl of Moray was also dead against the marriage. He didn't want Mary having children and bumping him down the line of succession. All this opposition just made Mary more determined than ever, though.
Diary, 7th July 1565. There are rumours that my brother Moray has been seen in England at the court of the Queen, that he is seeking arms and men to overthrow me and prevent my marriage. Truly, I was wrong ever to trust him, but he will not stop me marrying. H and I will marry secretly in 2 days' time.
We don't know if Mary really did have a secret wedding on the 9th of July, but the English ambassador wrote to Elizabeth telling her she had. Mary's official wedding did not take place until the 29th of July, and to be honest, it was a bit of a come-down after her first wedding.
Mary, Queen of Scots, arrived at St. Giles Cathedral at 6 of the morn yesterday to marry the love of her life, Henry Darnley. The marriage service was conducted according to Roman Catholic rites. However, the groom did not stay for the mass that followed. A source close to the royal couple suggested that the new king, whose father is a Protestant, thought it wiser not to partake of the Roman Mass at a time when feelings are strong about the religion of the Queen.
Now that the marriage was public, it was time to sort out Mary's brother Moray, who had come back from England with a troop of men to fight Mary. He didn't stand a chance. The Scottish nobles might not like having a young queen who had made her arrogant young husband their king, but the ordinary people adored her. They rose in support of her, and Moray and his pals were driven out of Scotland. Now, all Mary had to contend with was her new husband.
Chapter 6. Marry in haste, repent at leisure.
Now Darnley had got what he wanted. He behaved as if he wasn't married at all. He went out drinking and womanizing. Mary was pregnant by this stage and a bit upset by her husband's antics. She turned to her French and Italian servants for sympathy. David Riccio, in particular, found favour with the lonely queen. Riccio was Italian, but his official position was French secretary. This meant that he took care of Mary's French correspondence, and that he knew what she was saying to all her French relations. Lord William Maitland, who was Mary's official secretary, didn't, and he resented it. Darnley was jealous of Riccio and Mary. Soon, everyone was muttering and plotting with everyone else. The Earl of Moray, in exile down in England, was in on the plot. So was Darnley. The idea was to seize Riccio and put him on trial. But things got out of hand.
The Queen's secretary, David Riccio, was stabbed to death yesterday as the horrified Queen looked on helplessly. The Queen, who is 7 months pregnant, was dining with Riccio and 3 or 4 other courtiers when her husband entered the room via a back staircase. The Queen invited him to sit beside her, but before the King could do so, a gang of armed men burst into the room. They had come to take Riccio away. In the scuffle that followed, he received 56 stab wounds. When the physician got there, he was already dead. There has been no sign of the Queen since, who is rumoured to be a prisoner.
Moray and his pals had been due back in town that week because they were to be tried for rebellion. He timed his arrival so that it looked as if he couldn't possibly be involved in the plot. When he went to see Mary, he made out that he was absolutely disgusted by what had happened.
Diary, 11th March 1566. My brother swears he knew nothing of the plot. I know this is not true, but I need his help. He pretended that now he is happy with my marriage and helped me make up my quarrel with Darnley. I played along because I must escape. I have persuaded them that I think I am about to miscarry. Moray and the others have agreed to make Darnley my keeper on their behalf. Darnley swears he will do everything in his power to help me. So the plan is set.
That night at midnight, Darnley and Mary slipped out of a back door of the palace and escaped to Dunbar, where there was a castle loyal to Mary. It wasn't long before other nobles and men heard what had happened and came flocking to Dunbar to support her. Only a week after the murder of Riccio, the attempted coup was over, and Mary returned to Edinburgh. By her side was the Earl of Bothwell. Mary still suspected that both Darnley and Moray had been involved in Riccio's murder, but she issued a proclamation saying that she believed her husband was innocent. However, the other conspirators weren't having that, and they sent her proof of Darnley's involvement. There wasn't much Mary could do about it. She was about to give birth, and in those days, childbirth was a dangerous business. Mary knew that she might not survive it, and if she died, Scotland would be without a queen.
Diary, May 1566. I have made a will. Have been generous to Darnley and his family, but that's just to make up for the fact that he is not on the council, which will rule the country if I die. Have named Bothwell for that. He is a strong man, and I would have done far better to have married him instead. We'll think about how I can get rid of Darnley after I have had the baby. In the meantime, I have invited my brother and his cronies to remain in the castle with me as my guests. They are better where I can keep an eye on them.
Mary had a long and miserable labour, but at the end of it she produced a healthy baby boy, James. Messengers were sent to England straight away to Queen Liz, inviting her to be the baby's godmother. Mary was out and about quite soon after the birth. Royal mums didn't look after their own babies, so little Prince James was sent off to Stirling Castle with his nanny and wet nurse. Mary was still thinking about how she could get free of Darnley. Basically, the only two options were divorce or death. She was worried that divorce might put a question mark over her son's legitimacy. If James were illegitimate, then bang went his right to succeed to any throne, English or Scottish. It looked as if the only way out for Mary was for Darnley to meet with a nasty accident. At this stage, no one quite knows what Mary's relationship was with Bothwell. He had supported her after the murder of Riccio, and she had made him warden of Dunbar Castle. Darnley hated him, and so did Moray. Mary had come to depend on Bothwell, and he was a bit of a hunk.
Diary, October 1566. I don't know why I find him so attractive. He's short, he's not good-looking, though there is something rather sexy about that battered nose. And worst of all, he's Protestant and married, but he's always there for me. Oh, I must stop thinking like this. He is not nearly grand enough, and I am married anyway. But I do like him.
The royal christening was coming up, so Mary forgot her despair about getting rid of Darnley for a short time. Mary insisted on a good Catholic christening. The baby's godmother, Queen Liz, didn't come, but she sent a solid gold font as a gift. Darnley didn't attend the christening, and afterwards he went flouncing off to Glasgow. He was angry that everyone could see he was not in favour with Mary, and had a head full of schemes to overthrow her and rule on behalf of their son. Then suddenly, Darnley fell ill with a horrible disease. Mary sent her doctor to see him and eventually went over to Glasgow herself to visit him.
Diary, January 1567. His poor face is all covered in blisters. I feel quite sorry for him. His good looks all gone and feeling so ill, poor love. And he was pathetically pleased to see me. Now he is unable to go out drinking, and he is quite repentant and mild-mannered. And I almost remember what it was I saw in him. He has agreed to come back to Edinburgh with me. I think he still hopes for a reconciliation. But my plan is to have him where I can better keep an eye on him.
Darnley didn't altogether trust Mary. He refused to go to Craigmillar Castle, where she wanted to put him, and instead took up lodgings in a house called Kirk O'Field. Mary slept in a small bedroom beneath Darnley's. All seemed quiet and harmonious between the king and queen, until...
All Edinburgh was woken last night as a massive explosion rocked the city. As people rose from their beds, they found the house called Kirk O'Field, where the king had been staying, razed to the ground. Rescuers desperately searched by lamplight for survivors, but by morning, the Earl of Bothwell announced that the king's body and that of his page had been found a little way from the house. It was only by chance that the Queen had not been sleeping in the house. She had been attending a masque to celebrate the wedding of one of her French servants.
William Drury, the English ambassador, sent a sketch of the scene of the crime to Elizabeth's chief minister, Sir William Cecil.
February 1567. Dear William, please find enclosed a map of the scene of the crime, with bodies. Darnley was in his nightgown. His servant carried a cloak. It seems that they realized something was afoot and made their escape, lowering themselves from the bedroom window by rope onto a chair in the garden below before the house exploded. But someone saw them and dispatched them without mercy. The rope marks on their necks suggest they'd been strangled. As to who's responsible, rumours abound, but I have reliable information that Sir James Balfour purchased £60 worth of gunpowder in the week leading up to the explosion. The big question, of course, is why gunpowder when they're all so handy with their knives this side of the border? It only makes sense if the plan was to kill the Queen as well, and she herself seems to think that the plot was aimed at her. All the best, William Drury.
Mary behaved very strangely after the murder. She ordered the court into mourning, but she didn't behave like a grieving widow. She went to weddings, she hunted, and generally behaved as if she didn't care. A bit suspicious, you might think. The Scottish people were shocked to see the Queen living it up instead of grieving at home for the father of her child. Most people thought Bothwell was the chief murderer, and it stuck in their throats to see him riding around Edinburgh free as a bird. Because there had been no real effort to discover the murderers, Darnley's father, the Earl of Lennox, wrote to Mary, asking if it was okay to bring a private prosecution against Bothwell for Darnley's murder. Mary didn't want her beloved Bothwell put on trial, so she cunningly wrote back to Lennox,
24th March. Dear father-in-law, of course you may bring a private prosecution. In fact, the date has been set for the 12th of April. Just don't bring all your men with you. It will be a recipe for civil war. I suggest you bring a small retinue of no more than 6 men. Mary.
But Lennox knew there were at least 4,000 of Bothwell's supporters in Edinburgh. He had been planning to come with 3,000 of his own men, and he certainly wasn't stupid enough to come without them. He stayed away, and the trial went ahead without him. This was exactly what Mary and Bothwell had hoped for. He was found not guilty.
Chapter 7. And Another Hopeless Husband.
The night Bothwell was acquitted, he was out on the town with his cronies, as well as a few other people he wanted on his side. He wasn't just celebrating. He wanted their signatures on a document. This became known as the Ainsley Tavern Bond, and it said,
Seeing how James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, is completely innocent of all the evil deeds of which he has been accused, and seeing how the Queen is destitute of a husband, we would like to support the said James Bothwell in his generous offer to become her next husband.
all Bothwell's dinner guests signed it. The next day he took Maitland and another courtier with him for support and went to visit Mary to tell her the good news.
Diary, 20th of April 1567. The cheek of it! As if I could possibly marry him, after all that has happened. The whole country thinks he murdered Darnley. I told him point blank that it was out of the question. Apart from anything else, he's not long married. What about his poor wife? And yet Maitland is right when he says that the country needs a strong ruler. If I could marry him, it might be a good solution.
Mary spent the day in Stirling playing with baby James. On her return, just outside Edinburgh, she found Bothwell waiting for her with a troop of 800 men. He said he'd come to warn her that there was trouble in the city and that it wasn't safe for her to enter. He would take her to Dunbar. Some of Mary's bodyguards believed he was trying to kidnap her and were ready to fight, but Mary told them that the odds were stacked too heavily against them, and she didn't want an unnecessary bloodbath. No one really knew what was going on, whether Bothwell had kidnapped the Queen or whether Mary went along with it because it let her off the hook. Whatever her true feelings, Bothwell was divorced from his wife within days. They arrived back in Edinburgh together on the 6th of May and were married a few days later. Mary soon realised her mistake.
Diary, May 1567. The people of Edinburgh hate me, and worse, my church has abandoned me. The Holy Father, the Pope, has made it clear that he wishes to have no more to do with me. As for Bothwell, he is as vile and rude as Darnley. Behind closed doors, his temper is unspeakable. Moreover, Brother Moray is back in Scotland and mustering an army. What is to happen to me?
By the end of May, just 5 weeks after Bothwell had kidnapped her, Mary was so unpopular in Edinburgh that she and her new husband had to leave the city. By mid-June, Mary and Bothwell waited with a small army on Carberry Hill near Edinburgh, hoping for reinforcements. The rebel lords gathered on the opposite side of the valley. The French ambassador offered Mary a deal. If she abandoned Bothwell, the rebels would come over to her side. She refused. Then it was suggested that Bothwell could fight one of them in single combat. Bothwell agreed. Mary refused. Meanwhile, the reinforcements did not arrive, and worse, half of Mary's troops were going over to the enemy. Now the rebels offered again, ditch Bothwell and come over to us. Mary agreed, provided Bothwell was allowed to escape. The lords agreed to this. They didn't want Bothwell hanging around. He might bring up all the ways they'd been involved in Darnley's murder and everything else. So Bothwell scarpered, but not before he'd pressed into Mary's tired and sweaty hands proof that Morton, Moray, Maitland, and most of the other Scottish nobles had been involved in Darnley's murder. Mary had surrendered, thinking that she would still be treated as queen, but she was taken back to Edinburgh, and that night she was kept prisoner in the provost's house. She was kept there for a few days. The rebels had hoped that she would divorce Bothwell, but she refused to do so. Eventually, they decided to send Mary to Lochleven Castle, which stands on an island in the middle of Lochleven.
Chapter 8. A Scottish Alcatraz.
The Protestant lords knew it would be tough for Mary to escape from Lochleven. They also knew that the people who lived there wouldn't want her to escape. Sir William Douglas was related to most of Mary's current enemies. His mum, Lady Margaret, had been a girlfriend of Mary's dad and was none other than Lord James Stuart, Earl of Moray's mum. Pretty Geordie was William's brother and Margaret's youngest son. he soon fell helplessly in love with Mary.
Diary, June 1567. They have told me that they will only consider releasing me if I divorce Bothwell. I have told them it was out of the question. What they do not know is that I am pregnant. Even if I wish to divorce Bothwell, where would that leave the baby? Besides, Bothwell is my only hope. He may be a rough diamond, but diamond he is compared to these others.
Now that they knew that Mary wouldn't ditch Bothwell, the Lords had the perfect excuse for keeping her locked up. They wanted her to abdicate and agree to the coronation of baby James. She refused. Mary began to wonder how long it would be before they finished her off. Mary wasn't the only person worried about this. The English ambassador to Scotland, Sir Nicholas Throckmorton, who liked Mary, was also worried. At this point, cousin Liz decided to get in on the act. She sent Throckmorton with a message to the Scottish nobles, telling them that this was no way to treat a queen. If they couldn't deal with Mary, then Liz was quite happy to take over. She also suggested that baby James was brought to England to be looked after by his grandmother. In the middle of July, Mary had a miscarriage. She was very pale and weak when Lord Lindsay and another lord appeared with a new document and told her to sign or else. These were articles of abdication that said she resigned as Queen of Scots, gave the crown to her son James, and made her brother Moray regent. Mary had little choice but to sign. And on the 30th of July 1567, the one-year-old James was crowned King of Scotland. It was a bad summer for Mary. She became very ill from the stress of everything that had happened. She wrote again to Queen Elizabeth.
October 1567. Dear Cousin Liz, sorry not to have written to you before this, but things have been a bit difficult. I know that you will be outraged that I have been treated so badly. I am therefore asking you please to send English troops. A few hundred will do, because I know my own people well enough. When they see that I am in with a chance once more, they will rise to my defence. Some indication of when the troops can be expected would be most useful to my allies here. Thanking you in anticipation, I remain your most loving and devoted cousin, Mary.
She received no reply. And within a month a new rumour was circulating at the Scottish and English courts. Mary had asked pretty Geordie to marry her. Moray wasn't having that. He didn't want his sister flirting with her jailers. Geordie was ordered off the island. But this was all part of Mary's next cunning plan.
Diary, April 1568. Moray has fallen for it. The plan has worked. Now Geordie can sort things out on the mainland, while his little cousin Willie helps me here. The other piece of good news is that Maitland has sent me a ring. This can only mean one thing. He is back on my side, and preparations are afoot to spring me from this dreadful jail.
On the 1st of May that year, with the help of Willie Douglas, Mary managed to escape from Lochleven over to the mainland. That night, she wrote letters to everyone she could think of, telling them she was back in the game. And she sent a messenger to Denmark, where Bothwell had fetched up in prison, asking that he be released. However, although Mary was out of prison, she still wasn't her own woman. The men who had come to meet her were Hamiltons, who were enemies of Moray and Morton. They saw her as a pawn in their power game and suggested she went to the town of Hamilton. There she wrote to say that the abdication document she had signed was a load of rubbish, and that the Protestant lords who made her do it were a bunch of godless traitors. Now the Hamiltons told Mary that she hadn't a hope of getting her kingdom back unless she won it in battle. Moray had been caught on the hop by her escape, but he wasn't long in gathering an army. He had only half as many troops as Mary, but Mary's men were more interested in fighting each other. Mary was so desperate that she rode onto the battlefield herself to try and get them all going in the right direction. But within hours, Mary was on the run. With her was a small band of supporters led by Lord Herries.
Diary, May 1568. Herries tells me that I should sail for France. He argues that I have lands there and friends and could live there comfortably until the time is right to mount an attack on Moray. He says that the Queen of England is no friend of mine, but I am tired, and for all I know, my cousin's ships will intercept me in my flight. Then I will be her prisoner, and who knows what she may do. But if I land in England of my own free will, then I am her guest, and courtesy demands that she invite me to court. If we meet, then I know I can win her over.
Chapter 9. Guest of Her English Majesty.
The news soon reached London that the Scottish Queen had landed in England. There was consternation. Mary was a danger to Elizabeth because many Catholics thought she had a better claim to the English throne than Liz herself. So Mary was kept where she was, a long way from London. Liz sent a message saying that Mary couldn't possibly come to the English court until her name had been cleared of her husband's murder. Mary was livid and wrote back to Liz.
June 1568. Dear Cousin Liz, I should like to point out that it was at your request and against my own better judgment that I allowed the earls who now accuse me to return from exile in England. In the light of this, I think you bear some responsibility for the position in which I now find myself. Mary.
In response, Liz sent Lord Herries with a message saying that Mary must submit to a trial. If she agreed, Liz would restore her to the throne, whatever the outcome. Although if she was found guilty, the Lords would not be punished for their rebellion. Mary's first trial was a real put-up job. The trial itself was rigged to make it impossible for Mary to clear her name. She wasn't allowed to appear, and her own commissioners were half-hearted about defending her. To make sure the court found her guilty, Moray suddenly remembered a silver casket of letters which he claimed he'd found on one of Bothwell's supporters. When the Duke of Norfolk, who was heading the inquiry, read the letters, he told Queen Elizabeth that it would be impossible to find Mary not guilty. These were supposed to be letters from Mary which proved that she had plotted with Bothwell to kill Darnley. But were they genuine? Probably not. Most people today think that they were forgeries. They were copied out by hand for the court and then returned to Moray. They disappeared and have never been seen again. Meanwhile, Mary was fighting back with the only weapon she had, her sex appeal. With a bit of help from Lord Maitland, the Duke of Norfolk got it into his head that marriage to Mary would strengthen his claim to the English throne. When Liz found out, she was incandescent with rage. She took Norfolk off the inquiry and had him shut up in the Tower of London. Eventually, the court reached its verdict, or rather, its non-verdict.
After months of argy-bargy, in which the Scots Queen was not even allowed to see the main evidence against her, the court decided that she was not guilty of the murder of her husband, but that she was not innocent either. However, the English Queen has taken it upon herself to decide that Mary is not fit to rule.
By this time, it was blindingly obvious that Elizabeth was no friend of Mary's. Right away, she was moved to a new, more secure prison, Tutbury Castle in Staffordshire. There she was put in the hands of the Earl and Countess of Shrewsbury. The Earl of Shrewsbury was filthy rich and very mean. The Countess of Shrewsbury, Bess of Hardwicke, was that rare thing in Elizabethan England, a career woman. She bought and sold land, lent money, built houses, and married her children off to her stepchildren through her subsequent husbands to keep all the dosh in the family. Mary spent her days dreaming up schemes for getting out of prison. One possibility was to take yet another horrible husband. Liz had released the Duke of Norfolk from the Tower by this time, and Mary thought he was her best chance. But marriage between Mary and Norfolk was the last thing Elizabeth wanted. Norfolk was in touch with the Catholics in the north who wanted to rescue Mary and make her Queen of England in Liz's place. So Norfolk ended up in the Tower again, and Elizabeth moved Mary to Coventry Castle. This wasn't the end of the affair, though. Norfolk was flattered by Mary's attention. He liked the idea of rescuing Mary, so when Elizabeth let him out of jail, he began plotting again. The plot that Norfolk got involved with became known as the Ridolfi plot, after an Italian messenger who got caught with incriminating letters on him. This time, there were no more chances for Norfolk. He was tried and executed in 1572. Up in Scotland, arguments between the nobles resulted in several big changes. In 1570, Moray was shot dead by John Hamilton, who had a long-standing grudge against him. Lennox, Mary's father-in-law, became regent. He in turn died during a raid on Stirling Castle in 1571. The Earl of Morton then took his turn as regent. By 1574, Mary had had enough of her situation. She decided to make Elizabeth a sensible offer.
February 1574. Dearest cousin, I hope this letter finds you in good health. Knowing that a large part of the expense of keeping me in prison comes from your pocket, I would like to propose a way of saving you money. Why not allow me to return to my lands in France? I will bother no one there, and I am happy to live out my life quietly as mistress of my French estates. Mary.
Liz refused to let Mary disappear to France, but she did agree that Mary could spend a few weeks at Buxton Spa. There were hot springs there, and it was quite a social place. So every summer for quite a few years, Mary had a change of scene and new people to talk to. While Mary endured life as best she could, there were more changes abroad. Over in France, King Charles IX died and was succeeded by the Duke of Anjou. Bothwell also died in Denmark. He had been kept in such terrible conditions that he went mad and died chained naked to a pillar and raving. In 1580, the Earl of Morton was tried for the murder of Darnley. He was found guilty and executed. There was also bad news about Mary's son, James. The young king was kidnapped by ambitious noblemen. James was 15 and had recently begun ruling for himself. He was a prisoner for 10 months, till he managed to escape. For a while after that, he was a bit more sympathetic towards his mum. He even got in touch with the Duke of Guise to try and find a way of getting Mary out of prison. At last, one of her powerful Guise uncles got involved with the Pope and Spain in the second big plot to spring Mary and restore the Catholic religion. It became known as the Throckmorton plot, after Sir Francis Throckmorton. Liz's loyal minister, Sir Francis Walsingham, who ran the best intelligence service in the world at the time, knew that Mary was in secret correspondence with the ambassador, though. Throckmorton was caught, and the whole plot was blown open. Walsingham decided that enough was enough. As long as Mary was alive, she was trouble. It was time to get rid of her.
Chapter 10. The Final Plot.
After the Throckmorton plot, Mary was moved back to Tutbury, her least favourite prison. A new jailer was put in charge, Sir Amyas Paulet, a fierce Puritan who hated Mary.
Diary, January 1585. That ghastly man. He keeps such a sharp eye on me that there is not a chance of a secret letter getting through. I'm not even allowed ordinary letters.
This treatment was all part of Walsingham's plan to cut off Mary completely from the outside world. Then, without explanation, on Christmas Eve 1586, she was moved to Chartley Manor near Burton. And a few days later, she took delivery of 23 secret letters.
Diary, 16th January, 1586. by the most amazing good fortune, the local brewer turns out to be a friend. He has made a slim waterproof pouch into which he puts letters, and then, before a delivery, he inserts the pouch through a tube in the bung of one of the beer barrels. My letters can leave the castle by the same route when the barrel is empty. It means that I can be in touch with the Spanish ambassador, the French, and I can say anything I like, for this route is completely safe.
The route was not safe, however, and the brewer was not a friend. Walsingham was behind everything. He had working for him a Catholic agent called Gilbert Gifford. Gifford had been captured by the English intelligence service. Faced with the prospect of torture and a nasty death, he agreed to play along with Walsingham. He had visited the French embassy and told them that he could get letters to Mary. He had set up the beer barrel scam. Every letter to or from Mary went via Walsingham. Mary had become something of a romantic figure to many young Catholic Englishmen. A group of them were now hell-bent on helping her escape. Mary heard rumours about this plot, and she made another disastrous decision. She wrote a letter
to Sir Anthony Babington, somewhere near Wingfield, Derbyshire. 25th of June, 1586. Dear Master Babington, a little bird tells me that you're thinking of rescuing a certain lady in distress. Please tell me more. Mary, Queen of Scots.
Sir Anthony wrote back enthusiastically.
1st of July, 1586. Your Majesty, you are absolutely right. 7 of us have sworn to kill the rival who usurped you and keeps you prisoner. At the very same moment, I, personally, will come and release you. A. Babington.
Mary was worried that without foreign aid the plot would fail, and then where would she be? She brooded for 3 days, and then made yet another daft decision. She wrote a long letter to Babington, suggesting he ask the kings of Spain and France and the Duke of Guise for help. Walsingham, who was intercepting the letters, of course, added a P.S., asking who his co-conspirators were. Babington, who was as stupid as Mary, wrote back, and it wasn't long before Walsingham rounded up all the conspirators. Mary, of course, knew nothing about this. She only knew what Paulet told her, and he told her that she'd been invited to a stag hunt with the local gentry. The stag hunt took place on the 16th of August. Mary was still a good horsewoman, and she was ahead of the field when she saw that Sir Amyas Paulet was lagging at the back. She stopped to wait for him, and then saw a group of horsemen approaching.
Diary, 17th of August, 1586. For one short, glorious moment, I thought it was Babington and his men coming riding across the moor to rescue me and set me free. Instead, it was a messenger from vile Liz, come to accuse me of plotting against her life. I protested that I knew nothing about it, but they would have nothing but that I must go with them, alone.
Preparations began for a state trial. When Mary was told she was going to be tried, she had quite a lot to say about it.
I am myself a queen, the daughter of a king, a stranger and the true kinswoman of the Queen of England. I came to England on my cousin's promise of assistance against my enemies and rebel subjects, and was at once imprisoned. As an absolute queen, I cannot submit to orders, nor can I submit to the laws of England without injury to myself, the king my son, and all other sovereign princes.
Cecil and Walsingham had just passed a new law, which said that if there were plots on her behalf, Mary was guilty whether she knew anything about them or not. Mary knew there was absolutely no chance of her being found innocent, but at least she would get a chance to have her say in public. Mary was allowed no lawyers. She was not allowed to see any of the incriminating evidence beforehand, and she was not even allowed to take notes. Yet she spoke so well on her own behalf that many of the counsellors trying her ended up in tears. Despite this, the outcome was inevitable. On the 25th of October, Mary was found guilty of plotting against the Queen of England. Immediately there were calls for her execution. However, The last thing Liz wanted was to be responsible for executing Mary. She knew it would bring the wrath of every Catholic country in Europe down on her head. It took months for Liz to get round to dealing with the problem. When she did, it was because her secretary managed to slip the execution order in between a lot of other letters she was signing. Liz knew she was signing it, but she pretended she didn't. The Earl of Shrewsbury arrived at Fotheringay on the 7th of February 1587 and told Mary she was to be beheaded the following morning.
Diary, 8th of February 1587. The news was not exactly a surprise. I heard them hammering the scaffold weeks ago. Yet, when the moment came, I must confess I felt shock. I have done nothing but write letters these past few days. Have sent to Spain, saying that I disowned James. He's been a complete pill throughout. Plus he's a Protestant. And that I leave my rights in the English crown to Philip. I have made up gifts for all those I love, though God knows I have little enough left to give. Now I have one letter left to write, to King Henry in France. I have told him that my servants will tell him what really happened at my trial, and emphasising what I want the world to know, that I die because I am of the true faith, and I will wear red to prove it.
However, there was no sign of red as Mary entered the great hall of Fotheringay Castle the next morning. She was dressed in black, with a white wimple as she faced her death. The details of her execution are recorded in a letter by one of her servants.
My lady advanced towards the scaffold with dignity. Then did Fletcher, Dean of Peterborough, try to shout the last rites according to the Protestant tradition, but my lady spoke over him in Latin. Then her waiting women, Elspeth Curl and Jane Kennedy, helped my lady to disrobe. As they took away her black overskirt and mantle, the world could see that she was dressed in red, the colour of all the martyrs of the true church. Her eyes were bound with a white scarf. My lady knelt and, commending herself in Latin to our Lord Jesus, laid her head on the block. It was a messy business. The first blow from the axe bit into her skull, but did not kill her. It took 2 more blows to sever her head. Yet even when it was severed, my lady continued to pray for several minutes, for her lips were seen to move.
It wasn't just Mary's lips that moved. There were more shocks in store. First, the executioner picked up her head by the hair to show it to the 300 witnesses while he shouted, "God save the Queen!" But Mary's head rolled away from him across the floor, her hair grey and cropped very close to her skull. All he had left in his hands was her wig. Then, more horror. The body seemed to move. Everyone gasped, thinking this woman refused to die. Then, one of Mary's little dogs wriggled out from under her skirts. Mary, Queen of Scots, really was dead. The pretty little princess, who had led such a charmed life at the French court, ended up with a pretty ghastly life overall. Men fell in love with her right up to the end. But she married the wrong ones, and she escaped to the wrong country. She seemed to have a knack for always making the wrong decisions. We'll never know why Mary made so many mad decisions or chose such hopeless husbands. But people will no doubt go on being fascinated by her and try to make sense of her story, adding to all the thousands of poems, plays, novels and operas that have already been written about the dead glamorous and tragic Scottish Queen.